Let's get ready to rumble! You can't handle the truth.
As the war in Ukraine drags on, we have a president who has assured Ukraine that whatever they want, whatever they need, they can have it. We can continue to bail out Ukraine. We will bail out banks, but we won't bail out Palestine, Ohio. It's interesting how that works. Billions, hundreds of billions of dollars being filtered back to Ukraine. Some of us would believe that's payback for the grift that Hunter Biden was involved in Ukraine, where the Ukrainian government bought influence into the Joe Biden administration. But again, that's another commentary for another day. What the Uniparty on Capitol Hill, those that masquerade as Republicans along with Democrats, seemingly are all in bed on this concept of democracy is Ukraine, despite the fact Ukraine is not a democracy, and we must keep sending money there. We must be pro-war. We understand that guys like Lindsey Graham, this is how they actually have, gratification in life, and they work themselves into orgasmic climax in dreaming about wars that never end. That's just what kind of hawkish neocons they are. But as we head into a presidential election cycle, wouldn't it be nice to know what the people running for president, where they stand on all of this? And so Tucker Carlson sent out a questionnaire, and he asked on the Republican side, those who are running for president, where do you stand on this issue? Nikki Haley did not answer, but Donald Trump, of course, did.
So former President Donald Trump, who as of tonight is the front runner for the Republican nomination, sent a long and really interesting response. Russia would never have attacked Ukraine if I were president, he writes, not even a small chance. Trump says he opposes regime change in Russia. Quote, we should support regime change in the United States. That's far more important. The Biden administration are the ones who got us into this mess. Trump repeatedly refers to the risk of nuclear war, which he describes as absolutely real, and then he calls for a negotiated peace by Ukraine mediated by the United States. Quote, both sides are weary and ready to make a deal, Trump writes. The meeting should start immediately. There is no time to spare. Death and destruction must end now. Trump has been saying things like this and predicting this for 5 years now, and he's saying it again.
Clear, decisive, and Donald Trump has been saying things like this literally for years. He has a track record in that area, and when he says he opposes what's happening in Ukraine and our fighting a proxy war with Russia, basically using Ukrainian bodies, and this must end, and it must end now, that there is a very real chance of triggering World War III. That is Donald Trump's core conviction on that. Interesting to note that his former vice president does not feel the same way.
What's interesting, though, is that Trump's former vice president, Mike Pence, who is also running for president this year, opposes his old boss on nearly every point. We're paying the Ukrainians to fight Russia, Pence writes, so we won't have to fight Russians ourselves. Pence endorses even stricter sanctions against Moscow. He dismisses the risk of nuclear war as a, quote, bullying tactic from Putin. And then Pence suggests that anyone who disagrees with his views on Ukraine is a disloyal American. Quote, there is no room for Putin apologists in the Republican Party. Mike Pence did not specify who he was talking about, though we suspect this show is included in that treasonous category.
And yet, once again, I'm vindicated. I said 2 years into the Trump administration that I felt the drama and the problems that kept plaguing his administration from the inside, not even talking about the opposition he was getting from the outside, from the Democrats and even the Republicans at first on Capitol Hill, who didn't want to play nice with him and were skeptical based on Russian collusion, but that there was so much drama and turmoil inside the White House. Where was it coming from? Why was it happening? I said 2 years into his administration, Mike Pence was the enemy within. And I'm absolutely proven right yet again. Not only is he a neocon, but he is part of the military-industrial complex. And remember, it was Mike Pence, boys and girls, who gave us Anthony Fauci to head up our response to to COVID. Why? Because when Mike Pence was governor of Indiana and they had an outbreak of something there, he and Fauci became pals, and he handled the outbreak in Indiana. And then Fauci and Pence and Bill Gates traveled the world together, lecturing other countries on the need for mass inoculation. Bum, ba-dum, bum. You know, those little pieces of history that people forget about. So, right from the get-go, the establishment, the Uniparty, put Mike Pence in as Trump's VP. I know. His kids recommended that he bring him on as his running mate, and I think at the time Donald Trump was thinking, well, this is kind of a Reagan-esque move. We'll balance the ticket. And that's how Ronald Reagan got elected, by bringing George Bush on, not even realizing that he had literally invited the enemy in the camp. And that is what Trump did. And Pence has outed himself and basically saying, if you oppose what we're doing in Ukraine, you're unpatriotic, you ought to be censored, you ought to be censured, you are not for democracy, you know, you're not allowed to ask, talk, think, or ask questions. That's Mike Pence, the good guy that some of you think is a Christian, bullhawk. What about Ron DeSantis? Because he'd been playing his cards pretty close to his chest on this one, and finally he came out and echoed Donald Trump.
DeSantis is adamantly opposed to the position that most Republicans in Washington have taken on Ukraine. DeSantis is not a neocon. Who knew? Quote, while the U.S. has many vital national interests, DeSantis writes, securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness within our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. Without question, he writes, peace should be the objective. The U.S. should not provide assistance that could require the deployment of American troops or enable Ukraine to engage in offensive operations beyond its borders. F-16s and long-range missiles should therefore be off the table. These moves would risk explicitly drawing the United States into the conflict and drawing us closer to a hot war between the world's two largest nuclear powers. That risk is unacceptable.
Now, of course, because Rupert Murdoch and Fox News is all in on Ron DeSantis. They want Ron DeSantis to run against Donald Trump. Rupert Murdoch has made it abundantly clear he does not want Fox News hosts in any way endorsing or promoting Donald Trump. We know that Tucker Carlson is not a fan of Donald Trump as a person, but I do think Tucker Carlson agrees that the policies and the things that Trump did as president were actually far better for the country than what we have now, and that Trump actually, as a president, it worked, and the country worked. And so Tucker, who is kind of his own man over there at Faux Pas News, formerly known as Fox News, is doing stories where you got to talk about Trump because he's part of the story. And this is his way, you know, he led off with, this is where Donald Trump is at. Now, of course, he had to give the real positive, upbeat spin on Ron DeSantis, but in reality, Ron DeSantis left himself a whole lot of wiggle room. And I'm not the only one that sees it. You all know how I feel about Ron DeSantis. I think what he's done for Florida is good, but he is deep state. He has deep state connections, which means he has military-industrial complex connections. He was a JAG attorney. And what's happened in Florida has been, in some ways, a setup in that the powers that be in Washington, understanding that Trump has taken over the ideology of the Republican Party, and so the Republican establishment knows that they can't run somebody completely polar opposite of Donald Trump. That's not going to fly where Republicans are now thinking. So they had to find somebody who could look the part, talk the policies, but in a way that was more palatable, because they knew that wink, wink, behind closed doors, he was just going to be another establishment hack. Enter Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis, and I helped him get elected in Florida. Ron DeSantis has done a good job in Florida, but initially, and I've said this before, he was pulled farther to the right. He didn't move Florida to the right, Florida moved him. but also the powers that be helped him because they have allowed him to have these wins in Florida on everything from COVID to social justice issues to push back on woke culture. Why? They want him to be able to siphon away support from Donald Trump. This is a concocted plan completely. Make no mistake, Ron DeSantis is a war hawk. If you want to know how what he said is being received, don't just listen to what conservative pundits who are right now, it's great, Trump and DeSantis are on the same page. I like to listen to what the left is saying. What does the left pick up on? Because one thing the left, and when I say the left, I mean the progressives, not the woke left, nitwits, but the progressives who would be classic liberals who are very much anti-war. And they listen very carefully to these responses given from both parties when it comes to war and foreign policy, because they're looking and listening for where did he leave himself an out. Breaking Points, hosted by Sagar and Jetty and Crystal Ball, picked up on this immediately.
This is from the former NATO chief. He says it would be a geopolitical catastrophe if Trump were to be nominated because in the campaign, his influence would be destructive.
Based upon all of the polling data that we have, this is not a fringe view. Almost 50% of Americans agree with the approach and the rhetoric that Trump and DeSantis laid out there. As you said, let's be careful with DeSantis. He did leave himself a significant amount of wiggle room.
Yeah, so no doubt lobbyists that are big in Washington in trying to get support for Ukraine, which Rasmussen is, and he is on the record as saying it's only a matter of time when missiles and jet fighters are actually going to be going to Ukraine. Great, so they can sell it on the black market, because none of this money we're sending over there is actually going for a war effort. It's all going into Zelensky and the oligarchs' personal coffers as payback for the Hunter Biden grift. Bum, ba-dum, bum. We have a compromised agent in the Oval Office. He is a foreign agent in the Oval Office. Make no mistake about that. He is compromised by Ukraine and by China. And I think what Biden is also hoping in the back of his warped mind when it can put two cognitive thoughts together is he understands there's a dangerous alliance coming between Russia and China. And he's, been bought by China too. And he doesn't really want to have to, quote, fight China. So if he can fight Russia through Ukraine and eliminate that unholy pact of Russia and China getting together and thus completely crushing the U.S. economy, that's what's in the back of Warp Joe's mind, along with the fact he's paying back the grift to Ukraine. But why does Sagar and Crystal think that Ron DeSantis have left himself some wiggle room? And you know who else picked up on that, aside from Donald Trump, who said, Ron DeSantis is just becoming, I'm Pete and he's repeat. Every position I take, now Ron DeSantis takes. Well, Nikki Haley pointed that out, and then Sagar went right for the jugular on where Ron DeSantis really is at.
This is Nikki Haley. She says Trump is right when he says DeSantis is copying him, first in his style, then on entitlement reform, now on Ukraine. I have a different style than Trump, and while I agree with him on most policies, I do not on those. She goes on to say Republicans deserve a choice and not an echo.
I actually do think Nikki Haley is correct. Ron DeSantis has previous very hawkish views on Russia. He said that there's no distance between myself and Ronald Reagan. He criticized President Obama for not sending enough heavy weaponry to Ukraine. Again, look, maybe he changed his view. I have no idea. Rhetorically, I still think it is a victory that he is not taking the neocon line. But as Michael Tracy and others have been pointing out, while he intimated that it is not a core national security interest to support Ukraine against Russia, he did not necessarily use the ironclad language. And if you parse what he said about not sending F-16s and about not getting U.S. ground troops involved, that's basically the Biden policy. DeSantis did not go as far as Donald Trump, who literally is calling for immediate peace talks between Ukraine and Russia and promising to bring the conflict to a close in 24 hours.
100% right, and Tucker didn't point it out. I don't know if Tucker didn't point it out because he didn't realize what he was reading from Camp DeSantis, or because, he's got to give the Fox propaganda line that, Ron DeSantis is the second coming of Jesus. We can't say anything bad about him. DeSantis is basically saying there, hey, look, right now I don't want to get involved in a territorial thing, but he left himself. Trump didn't. Trump said absolutely day one, the United States, we have to sit down with Zelensky and Putin, and there needs to be peace, and it needs to happen within 24 hours. It just needs to be over and done, period. Ron DeSantis did not do that. Those of you that are getting excited about, I think Ron DeSantis, be careful, be careful, be careful. He may give you and I some things that we want on some of the social issues we care about. But behind closed doors, make no mistake, he is 100% establishment.